In the meticulous machinery of war, every man was meant to have a file, every transfer a manifest, every meal a record. The sheer bureaucratic weight of World War II was staggering. A mountain of paper designed to account for every single soul, caught in its unforgiving gears. Yet, some simply vanished. Their names, once etched into official ledgers, seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only the chilling void of unanswered questions. This wasn't a matter of combat deaths or forgotten graves. These were men held captive, under strict watch, whose very existence evaporated from the records. What force could possibly orchestrate such a profound, silent absence? And what could possibly connect their disappearance to a shocking discovery made not on a battlefield, but in the quiet hum of an archive, 3.5 decades later? Take a moment to consider that, and let us know where you are watching this from. The hum of the microfiche reader was a low, constant companion in the San Antonio archive that spring of 1981. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light slicing through tall arched windows, settling on the worn wooden surfaces and the countless boxes lining the shelves. Eleanor Vance, a civilian archivist with a reputation for chasing down the most obscure historical threads, found a certain solace in this quiet industry. Her fingers, accustomed to the brittle texture of aged paper, moved with practiced ease across the controls of the machine. She was, coincidentally, the daughter of Captain Arthur Vance, a man who had served his country with distinction, a detail that perhaps deepened her dedication to the historical truth. Eleanor was researching post-war naturalization records for a local historical society, a task often tedious, yet occasionally yielding unexpected fruit. On this particular morning, a faint metallic scent of old filings and forgotten ink hung in the air, almost imperceptible. She scrolled through reel after reel, the glowing screen illuminating faces and names from a forgotten era. Then, an anomaly flickered into view, an application for a Kenneth Tanner. Dated 1952, the birth date listed April 17, 1920 snagged her attention. It was identical to that of Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese prisoner of war whose file she had seen referenced in another context just weeks prior. A shiver, not of cold, but of recognition, traced her spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. This felt like a deliberate echo across time. The file itself was thin, unremarkable at first glance, but tucked inside, almost as an afterthought, was a small, notarized affidavit. Its paper felt unusually crisp, almost new, contrasting with the faded documents around it. The text was terse, authoritative, signed by a retired intelligence operative, then living in quiet obscurity in rural California. It stated, with unsettling clarity, that Mr. Tanner's identity was established through confidential military channels in 1945, ensuring his continued service to the United States. What kind of service could possibly demand such a profound erasure of one's former self? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The affidavit bore a chilling directive at its top right corner: eyes only, destroy after reading. Yet, here it was, inexplicably filed, a ghost in the bureaucratic machine. It referred to a specific physical characteristic, a scar just above the left eyebrow, identical to the one noted in Kenji Tanaka's original Camp Hearn medical file. This wasn't an escape. This wasn't an unrecorded death. This was a deliberate, high-stakes recontextualization, a bureaucratic disappearance orchestrated at the highest levels. How could a man, once a prisoner of war, simply vanish from the official record, only to reappear years later under a new identity, sanctioned by the very government that held him captive? And what other secrets, hidden in plain sight within the vast, dusty archives, still await discovery? The immediate fallout for families in Japan, who had mourned sons like Kenji for decades, was profound and painful. Telegrams from the War Department, once declaring men missing in action, presumed deceased, now seemed a cruel deception. The discovery of this single, cryptic document opened a Pandora's box, challenging the integrity of official war records and casting a long shadow over the true fate of many Japanese POWs who never returned home. Local newspapers in Texas and Kansas quietly speculated, fueled by the whispers of former camp personnel, about other ghosts in the system, men who had either chosen to remain or were compelled to. The historical record, once seemingly complete, now revealed gaping holes, raising uncomfortable questions about the cost of wartime secrecy. What other secrets, hidden in plain sight within the vast, dusty archives, still await discovery? And how many more vanished souls are waiting for their true stories to finally emerge? Eleanor Vance felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The faint hum of the microfiche machine, usually a soothing backdrop, now seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. This wasn't just a record, it was a revelation, shattering the quiet order of her archive. Her eyes, usually scanning for patterns, now darted across the text, searching for any additional clues on the Kenneth Tanner application. The ink on the affidavit was a deep, almost black hue, standing out starkly against the yellowed paper of the surrounding forms. It suggested urgency, a recent addition, or perhaps a deliberate act of misfiling that had accidentally preserved it. She pulled the original Camp Herm medical file for Kenji Tanaka. Its paper felt rougher, more worn, bearing the faint, metallic scent of bureaucratic history. The description of the scar, left eyebrow, approximately 1.5 centimeters irregular, was undeniably precise, a chilling match. Camp Hearn, nestled in the flat, expansive landscape of central Texas, had been one of the largest Japanese POW camps during the war. It was a place where thousands of lives were meticulously cataloged, their every movement, every ailment, every minor infraction recorded. How could such a system simply allow a man to vanish from one identity and reappear under another? This wasn't an oversight, it was an operation. The afternoon light began to soften, painting long shadows across the rows of filing cabinets. But Eleanor remained fixed, her focus unbroken. She began cross-referencing names, dates, and any mention of special programs or intelligence debriefings from Camp Hearn's operational logs, a task that demanded a particular kind of patience. The air conditioning unit, usually a steady murmur, seemed to whir louder, a constant, dry whisper in the quiet room. She recalled a conversation with Dr. Hiroshi Sato, a visiting scholar from the University of Tokyo specializing in post-war Japanese diaspora, who had once mentioned the persistent rumors among families of POWs who simply disappeared, never to be heard from again, officially. Sato's research, though anecdotal, pointed to a pattern of unexplained absences that official records failed to account for. Her fingers traced the faded entries in a Camp Hearn transfer manifest from late 1945. Kenji Tanaka's name appeared, marked "Transferred to Undisclosed Facility, Intelligence Liaison." That phrase, intelligence liaison, was the key, a bureaucratic euphemism that could hide a multitude of operations. It was a faint pencil mark, almost erased, a ghost of an instruction. The idea that men, once captured, could be repurposed, their identities reshaped for covert objectives, was a concept both fascinating and deeply disturbing. It raised a fundamental question about the ethical boundaries drawn in wartime, blurring the lines between enemy combatant and unwilling asset. If you find yourself drawn to uncovering these hidden chapters of history, the kind of stories that challenge official narratives and reveal the human cost of global conflicts, consider subscribing to World War II Stories. We're dedicated to bringing these meticulously researched accounts to light, ensuring these crucial pieces of the past are never truly lost. Eleanor continued her deep dive, the paper files rustling softly with each turn. She unearthed a memo, stamped restricted, detailing a linguistic asset program initiated by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in late 1944. The memo, signed by then-Colonel William J. Donovan, the head of the OSS, outlined the urgent need for Japanese-speaking personnel for post-war reconstruction and intelligence gathering in occupied Japan. The document itself was crisp, its typewritten letters still sharp, a stark contrast to the faded handwriting in other files. It hinted at a desperate scramble for resources, a willingness to leverage any available talent, even from within enemy ranks. Could Kenji Tanaka have been one of these linguistic assets? The possibility felt like a sudden, cool breeze sweeping through the archive, chilling her with its implications. This was not merely about a vanished man, it was about a clandestine program, operating in the shadows of the official war effort. And how many others, like Kenji Tanaka, were swept into this secret current, their fates forever altered by a quiet directive. The idea that men, once captured, could be repurposed, their identities reshaped for covert objectives, was a concept both fascinating and deeply disturbing. It raised a fundamental question about the ethical boundaries drawn in wartime, blurring the lines between enemy combatant and unwilling asset. If you find yourself drawn to uncovering these hidden chapters of history, the kind of stories that challenge official narratives and reveal the human cost of global conflicts, consider subscribing to WW2 Stories. We're dedicated to bringing these meticulously researched accounts to light, ensuring these crucial pieces of the past are never truly lost. Eleanor continued her deep dive, the paper files rustling softly with each turn. She unearthed a memo, stamped restricted, detailing a linguistic asset program initiated by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in late 1944. The memo, signed by then-Colonel William J. Donovan, the head of the OSS, outlined the urgent need for Japanese-speaking personnel for post-war reconstruction and intelligence gathering in occupied Japan. The document itself was crisp, its typewritten letters still sharp, a stark contrast to the faded handwriting in other files. It hinted at a desperate scramble for resources, a willingness to leverage any available talent, even from within enemy ranks. Could Kenji Tanaka have been one of these linguistic assets? The possibility felt like a sudden, cool breeze sweeping through the archive, chilling her with its implications. This was not merely about a vanished man. It was about a clandestine program operating in the shadows of the official war effort. And how many others, like Kenji Tanaka, were swept into this secret current, their fates forever altered by a quiet directive. The OSS program, codenamed Operation Phoenix, wasn't officially declassified until 1978, a detail Eleanor knew from her previous research into Cold War intelligence. Its existence explained how men could vanish from one set of records and reappear in another, but the why remained complex. The documents she now held suggested a deliberate recruitment effort within POW camps, targeting individuals with specific skills. Imagine the scene: a plain-clothed operative, perhaps smelling faintly of stale tobacco and institutional disinfectant, approaching a young man like Kenji Tanaka in the sterile confines of Camp Hearn. The offer would have been simple, yet loaded: cooperation for a chance at a future beyond the barbed wire. The faint scent of pine cleaner in the archive seemed to mock the grim reality of such negotiations. Professor David Chen, a historian at Stanford University specializing in wartime intelligence, notes in his seminal work, Shadows of the Rising Sun, that the psychological manipulation of POWs was a cornerstone of OSS strategy, particularly as the war neared its end. The promise of freedom, even citizenship, was a powerful lever against men facing an uncertain future, many of whom had already been disavowed by their own government for being captured. This wasn't about patriotism. It was about survival, about making an impossible choice under duress. A declassified OSS recruitment pamphlet from 1945, which Eleanor found buried in a box labeled Miscellaneous Training Materials, painted a rosy picture of opportunities for a new life and contributing to a stable peace. The paper felt surprisingly smooth, almost glossy, a stark contrast to the rough texture of the prison manifests. These recruits, once selected, would have been transferred to clandestine facilities, often in remote parts of the American Southwest, far from prying eyes. One such facility was a former Civilian Conservation Corps camp near Santa Fe, New Mexico. Repurposed with high fences and armed guards, its existence a closely guarded secret. Here, they would undergo intense re-education and training. Language skills were honed, cultural nuances exploited, and loyalties tested. The rattle of a distant train, occasionally heard through the archive windows, brought to mind the isolated journeys these men must have taken. Their past lives shedding like old skin, they were taught new names, new backstories, new ways of seeing the world. But how complete could such a transformation truly be? Could a man ever truly erase his original identity, his family, his heritage, even for the promise of a new life? Eleanor found another name mentioned in the Operation Phoenix memo. Lieutenant Colonel James Sterling, a counterintelligence officer known for his ruthless efficiency. Sterling's handwritten notes in the margins, scrawled in a bold, assertive ink that had bled slightly through the thin paper, emphasized the need for absolute compartmentalization and total severance from previous identity. He wrote of the program's indispensable utility in the post-war occupation of Japan, where American forces faced a monumental task of administration and cultural navigation. The very air in the archive, usually still, seemed to vibrate with the urgency of Sterling's words. It became clear that the objective wasn't just to gain intelligence, but to create a network of operatives who could blend seamlessly into a defeated, occupied nation, feeding information back to the Americans. This wasn't just Kenji Tanaka. This was a system, a factory of new identities. What kind of psychological toll would such a radical transformation take on these men, forced to live a lie, forever cut off from their past? And what secrets did they carry, not just for the Americans, but for themselves? The psychological toll of Operation Phoenix was immense, a silent burden carried by men forced to shed their very identities. Imagine a life lived in constant dissimulation, where every word, every gesture, every memory had to be filtered through a manufactured persona. The cold, institutional scent of the Santa Fe facility, mentioned in a declassified OSS memo describing its conversion, would have been a constant reminder of their new reality, a stark contrast to the familiar smells of home they had left behind. These men, once Japanese soldiers, were now being molded into American assets, their past erased, their future dictated. Eleanor Vance discovered a series of heavily redacted training logs from 1946, meticulously typed on a manual typewriter whose keys would have clacked with rhythmic precision during their creation. These logs, though incomplete, hinted at the rigorous program, intensive English language immersion, American cultural etiquette, and detailed instruction on post-war Japanese political factions. One entry, dated July 12, 1946, noted, "Subject Tanaka, Code Kestrel, demonstrates exceptional aptitude for cultural assimilation and linguistic nuance." The detail felt chillingly clinical, reducing a human being to a project. These recruits were not merely taught, they were reprogrammed, their minds becoming battlegrounds where two identities constantly vied for dominance. The faint, metallic tang of the microfiche reader seemed to intensify as Eleanor processed the implications, sensing the weight of these vanished lives. For Kenji Tanaka, now Kenneth Tanner, this meant a complete severance. His family in Japan, who believed him dead, would never know he was alive, let alone working for the very nation that had defeated his homeland. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a cultural anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of The Unseen Front, notes that such psychological operations often created individuals trapped between worlds, haunted by their past and alienated from their present. Their loyalty was a fragile construct, constantly tested by the ghosts of their former selves. The archive air, usually dry and still, seemed to press in, making the quiet room feel smaller, heavier. These linguistic assets were deployed into occupied Japan, tasked with gathering intelligence, identifying potential threats, and aiding the American administration. They walked the streets of Tokyo and Osaka, blending in, speaking their native tongue, yet harboring a profound secret: the aroma of street food, the sound of wooden clogs on cobblestones, the familiar cadence of Japanese conversation. All these sensory details that would have once grounded them in their identity now served as tools for their deception. They were spies in their own land, their former allegiances replaced by a new, often conflicted, purpose. What kind of moral compromises did they make, day after day, living this double life? If this insight into the hidden gears of history, the profound human cost of wartime strategy, resonates with you or challenges what you thought you knew, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. Eleanor found a brief mention in a 1951 declassified CIA field report, signed by a junior operative, describing informant Kestrel's successful infiltration of a nascent nationalist group in Kyoto. The report, typed on thin, crackly onion skin paper, detailed sensitive information provided by the informant, critical to American efforts to stabilize the region. It was a stark reminder that Kenji Tanaka's sacrifice was not abstract. It had real, tangible consequences. The report concluded with a recommendation for continued deep cover deployment, suggesting that Kenneth Tanner's mission was far from over, his new identity permanently etched into the fabric of his existence. The responsibility of such a life, forever looking over one's shoulder, forever fearing exposure, must have been suffocating. This wasn't merely about national security. It was about individuals stripped of their agency, their personal histories weaponized. The paradox deepened. To ensure their effectiveness, these men had to be entirely convincing, yet their very conviction was built on a foundation of lies. The cool metal of the filing cabinet drawer she was now opening felt heavy in her hand, as if burdened by the weight of these choices. They were caught in a strategic web, their fates determined by distant directives, their original identities dissolved like sugar in water. And how many more men, like Kenji Tanaka, were living out these secret lives, their true names and stories buried beneath layers of carefully constructed deception, waiting for a chance to surface? The cold metal of the filing cabinet drawer she was now opening felt heavy in her hand, as if burdened by the weight of these choices. They were caught in a strategic web, their fates determined by distant directives, their original identities dissolved like sugar in water. And how many more men like Kenji Tanaka were living out these secret lives, their true names and stories buried beneath layers of carefully constructed deception, waiting for a chance to surface? Eleanor Vance knew this wasn't an isolated incident. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of mildew and aged paper, a signature of deep archive sections, surrounded her as she ventured further into the labyrinth of post-war military intelligence files. Her initial discovery of Kenneth Tanner's application was a thread, but she suspected it was part of a much larger tapestry. The sheer volume of documents was overwhelming, a deliberate bureaucratic fog designed to obscure, rather than illuminate. She specifically began to search for any mention of repatriation anomalies or unaccounted personnel within the Japanese POW records, knowing that official language often masked uncomfortable truths. She found a series of interdepartmental memos from 1947, labeled Post-Hostilities Personnel Review, that briefly discussed the discrepancy rate in POW accounting. One such memo, penned by a Lieutenant Colonel Robert S. McNamara, then a relatively unknown statistician joining the War Department, noted a statistically significant number of Japanese POWs whose final disposition records remain open, despite presumed repatriation or death. The ink on his signature was surprisingly dark, almost forceful, suggesting the urgency of the matter even then. McNamara's report, though carefully worded, implied that a substantial number of men had simply dropped off the radar, their official trails ending abruptly, This wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. The silence of the archive, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, filled with the unspoken stories of these vanished men. Eleanor remembered a conversation with Dr. Akiko Ishikawa, a Japanese historian specializing in war trauma and memory, who had extensively documented the enduring grief of families who never received definitive answers about their loved ones. Dr. Ishikawa's research highlighted how the lack of closure created a phantom limb effect in the collective memory, a persistent ache for what was lost but never truly accounted for. The cool, dry air from the vents seemed to carry the weight of that collective sorrow. Eleanor expanded her search to include other POW camps, particularly those known for housing Japanese prisoners with advanced language skills or technical expertise. She found scattered references, coded and obscure, to special debriefing units and voluntary re-education programs at camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Savage in Minnesota. These facilities, far from the public eye, became fertile ground for Operation Phoenix. A grainy black and white photograph, tucked into a declassified report on interrogator training, showed a group of young Japanese men in civilian clothes, not uniforms, their faces carefully blurred, standing in front of a nondescript building. The stark contrast between their former military attire and this new anonymity was striking, a visual testament to their transformation. The psychological burden on these men, forced to live a double life, was immense. Professor Kenji Tanaka, no relation to Kenji Tanaka, the POW, a leading expert on identity formation in post-conflict societies at the University of Hawaii, emphasizes that the erasure of one's original identity, especially within a collectivist culture like Japan, constitutes a profound psychological violence. These individuals were forced to become strangers to themselves, their pasts a constant, dangerous secret. The hum of the microfiche machine seemed to pulse with the quiet agony of such an existence. They were not just spies, they were men fractured, living a carefully constructed lie day in and day out, forever vigilant. Eleanor discovered a series of internal OSS memos from 1948, discussing the long-term viability of the Phoenix assets. Many operatives, the memos noted, struggled with reintegration issues and persistent psychological distress. One handwritten note in the margin, initialed WJD, likely William J. Donovan, expressed concern about leakage and the moral implications of the program, even as he defended its strategic necessity. The ink was faded, almost ghostly, on the thin paper, yet the words carried a chilling clarity. It became clear that even the architects of the program understood the profound human cost, the ethical tightrope they walked. The paradox of their existence was stark. To serve one nation, they had to betray another, and in doing so, betray a part of themselves. They became instruments, their identities a carefully crafted illusion. The faint smell of ozone from the microfiche machine, typically associated with new technology, here mingled with the musty odor of old secrets, creating a pungent atmosphere of hidden histories. Eleanor realized that the true number of vanished POWs was likely far greater than any single document suggested. A silent diaspora of men whose stories were deliberately overwritten. The question wasn't just how Kenji Tanaka vanished, but who else disappeared and what their lives and deaths truly entailed. What other profound truths lay buried just beneath the surface of the official narrative, waiting for a persistent archivist to unearth them? Eleanor Vance's discovery, once brought to light, ignited a quiet but persistent campaign for recognition. Her findings, initially met with bureaucratic resistance, eventually prompted a limited review by the Department of Defense in the late 1980s. While no sweeping official apology or full disclosure of every Phoenix asset ever occurred, the existence of such programs became an undeniable, if still sensitive, part of the historical record. The revelation of men like Kenji Tanaka, living under assumed identities, offered a painful, belated form of closure for some families in Japan who had clung to the hope of their son's survival. The cold, sterile hum of the microfiche reader had given way to a profound human reckoning. The paradox of the vanished POWs, it turned out, was not a failure of record-keeping, but a consequence of deliberate, strategic design. These men didn't disappear, they were transformed, their identities reforged on the anvil of wartime necessity and post-war geopolitical maneuvering. Their silent absence from the official repatriation lists made tragic sense within the covert logic of Operation Phoenix, a program that prioritized intelligence and stability over individual identity and family ties. The cost was immense. Lives lived in perpetual secrecy, families left to mourn ghosts, and a historical narrative fractured by classified truths. The scent of old paper and dust in the archive now seemed to carry the faint, lingering echo of those untold sacrifices. What do you think about the ethical lines crossed in the name of national security during wartime? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're compelled by these hidden stories that reshape our understanding of history, consider subscribing to WWE Stories. We're committed to unearthing more profound truths, ensuring that these crucial chapters are never truly forgotten.